Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Slavery Archive Book Club. My name is Ana Lúcia Araújo, and today we are here to discuss then a multi-volume series titled A Cultural History of Slavery and Human Trafficking. And this is a series edited by historian Benjamin Lawrence, who is here with us. And each of the volumes has then different editors. So I will introduce Benjamin very quickly, and after that we can move to the others and also to the discussion. So Benjamin Lawrence, he is a full professor at the University of Arizona. He is a legal historian. He published then 20 volumes, then including then monographs and edited volumes. And he is the editor of this series that has been in progress then for about for several years. Then it started before the pandemic. The series was published last year in 2024 with Bloomsbury. And this is a series then starting in antiquity and coming up to the present with several volumes. Several of you had access to the volumes because those who registered had then the digital access to the digital volumes. So we are starting now, and I pass then the word to Benjamin. I have one of the volumes here. Then I contributed to one of the volumes, but this is a very beautiful collection, and I will leave them now to Benjamin to introduce it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ana Lucia. Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are. I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you this work and this cultural history of slavery and human trafficking. As Ana Lucia mentioned, it has been a project that has been going on for almost 10 years. So I first conceived of this project in conversation with some Bloomsbury editors back at the AHA, that's the American Historical Association meeting in 2015, 2016, and discussed what it might look like. And then I decided it was absurdly ambitious and I really something that I shouldn't be doing and wouldn't do. And then they came back to me shortly after and twisted my arm a little bit. And that's how it came to pass. So, as some of you may know, Bloomsbury Cultural History Series is quite a long-standing published series of books. They all follow a very similar format. They almost all consist of 6 volumes, and they attempt to tell the history, the cultural history of a theme or a topic, or sometimes an idea or a conceptual framework. And they've been doing this now for quite a long time. There's a number of excellent series that have appeared, notably Labor came out several years ago, which is perhaps of most interest to people participating today. And when I was asked to do this, I said that I'm interested in doing it, but I do not want to recreate another large-scale encyclopedia-type study of slavery that is Eurocentric and edited by white males, albeit myself being a white male. I didn't want it to look like the things that had been done over and over again. I didn't want it to center the transatlantic slave trade or ancient Greece and Rome exclusively. I wanted it to do as much as possible, at least as much as was possible for us to write globally and expansively. And that meant a number of different things, including recreating a different type of periodization, a periodization that didn't use this terminology that many of the cultural history series use, for example, Renaissance, which has no bearing and no relevancy in many parts of the world, and to develop a periodization and an organizational structure, and also to develop chapter topics and subject matter that were germane to studies of enslavement, coercion, and human trafficking. But then the second dimension that was very important to me was really to continue part of my own research agenda, which is to bring slavery studies and human trafficking studies into conversation. Because as some of you know, I published on this subject before, and one of my persistent pet theories is that the 19th century is not an age of abolition, but an age of child enslavement, massive expansion in enslavement. More people are enslaved than ever before in the 19th century, and into the 20th century, again, even greater still. So the idea of abolition for me is anathema. And it was very important for us to think about not only a periodization and structure, but a group of scholars who could achieve that goal. So like-minded scholars, people who are committed to an enterprise and the activities that involved. And so I was thrilled when last year it finally appeared, and it was very much a labor of love over many years, but that's because I had an extraordinarily accomplished and effective team of scholars to work with. And so I'm very fortunate that today that the volumes are represented here by my editors, and I'm going to briefly introduce them all, the ones who are present. Not everybody is able to make this time slot on the Saturday afternoon, but we have with us Grant Parker, who is a professor at Stanford University and co-edited Volume 1. Hello and welcome. Thank you, Grant. And I know you're traveling, and Grant will introduce himself and his volume in a moment. We then have sorry, people, the windows keep changing. Angela Zhang, who is here. I think you're actually in Canada at the moment. Is that right, Angela? And Angela was one of the co-editors of Volume 2, and she will introduce herself and her work, and then also the volume. We're very fortunate to have my own colleague at the University of Arizona, Ryan Kashanipour, Ari Kashanipour, and I believe you're in your office in Arizona. And no, shaking his head. No, that's right. No, you're in the Capitol. That's right. He has another life as a lobbyist and a political activist. And we have with us the editor of Volume 4, Mariana Candido, who is at Emory University, and the editor of Volume 5, Henrice Altink, who is at York University, who will share information about the fifth volume. And I think at this time, the editor of the sixth volume hasn't joined the meeting, but may yet be able to join. So without further ado, having briefly given an overview of the purpose of the volume, at least the guiding ethos that's helped me as I sought out individuals who could edit and manage the incredible amount of work that went into this series, I'm going to allow each of them to talk about their own volumes. I just want you to bear in mind that of the editors that are here, there are a couple who aren't here, but I want to acknowledge them. There's, of course, David Cohen at Stanford, who co-edited Volume 1, Tom MacMaster, who co-edited Volume 2, and TJ MacMaster or Tom MacMaster, and then Professor Ventrella, who is the editor of Volume 6. And so each of the volumes has its own series of authors. In total, I have multiple times added up the numbers of authors, but I believe the total number of authors for the 6 volumes is more than 60 authors. So if the Academy is herding cats, I don't even know if there's a metaphor to explain what this project was, but without any more nonsense from me, I'll turn it over to Grant. Thank you, Grant.
Thank you very much indeed, Benjamin. Thank you, Anna, and hello, everybody. When Benjamin first approached me with the topic of the first volume, I teach ancient studies at Stanford University. I also have a second string in African studies, by the way. My response was, no, that's not really possible. But Benjamin is persuasive. Perhaps it's his work with legal studies, and Benjamin's enthusiasm is infectious, and so together with my Stanford colleague David Cohen, I took on the job of coordinating the first volume. Now, this volume is focused on what we might pretty safely call a pre-modern period. So there's no part of the world for which the period roughly 1200 before the Common Era to roughly 500 of the Common Era is anywhere called modern. So I think it's pretty safe to call this a pre-modern period. And so what unites this volume is the need to look beyond written sources. Greece and Rome, the ancient Mediterranean, and other ancient Mediterranean societies give us what is pretty much a range of written and documentary sources for this ancient period. However, the written record is highly discrepant. We hear much more about ancient Greek, Roman, Egyptian, Jewish, Hittite, and other ancient societies than others. Well, how can this be a global history? Well, that is an enormous challenge because if we are to get beyond the normal constraints, the normal myopia of Greek and Roman studies, we really need to look into other kinds of other regions of the world. Well, that goes without saying. That's very much in the spirit of Bloomsbury's volume. The question is how we do that. Okay, my training in classics is pretty much to look at limited and small fragmentary evidence in the greatest of detail. And in fact, if you look at early histories of Greek and Roman slavery, and there are quite a few from pretty much the later 20th century, they very much focus on extrapolate from anecdotes. And it's only fairly recently in the last generation or two of scholars that economic historians have taken a quantitative approach. And that is an approach that is actually pursued by many of my colleagues in my own department. Not so much myself. I'm more traditionally oriented. I will be the first to admit that. Nonetheless, the key point is that if we're going to tell a broader picture, if we're going to approximate Bloomsbury's goal of a global history and a cultural history, we have to be ready to paint in broader brush strokes than I was trained to do, actually. And so for me, it's been an experience in telling a bigger picture. Now, while I was involved in this process and working with wonderful authors to realize the vision of Benjamin for this volume, some writing appeared, and I'm happy to provide details for anyone who's interested, that questioned the knowledge of what is at stake with histories of slavery. And so we have authors like Vlasopoulos who tell us, no, we can't write histories of slavery. We need to write about slaveries. That any understanding of enslavement has to be very intensely contextualized historically, and that comparison is actually flawed from the start. In fact, to put it in an extreme way, that it's a nominalist fallacy. We can't imagine that just because we have a term slave, just because we have a term slavery, there is a phenomenon that we can compare between all these different cultures, all these different periods. That is a radical critique. And in a way, it's impossible to take that critique fully on board. But for me, that is an encouragement to read these chapters together, to read the chapter on gender, to read in not just one volume, but in other volumes of the same series, to read the chapter on whatever the topic is. So thank you very much for this chance to explain the rationale of the volume and the chance to take part in this project from which I learned so much.
Thank you so much, Grant. That was lovely. And now we'd like to hear from Angela Zhang.
Hi, so my name is Angela, and I'm the editor for Volume 2, a co-editor with Thomas MacMaster, and I'm currently teaching at Harvard University. And I just finished my postdoc. And now when Benjamin came to me with this project, it was about a third of the way finished, two-thirds thereabouts, and I was actually writing my dissertation. So it was it wasn't it was I really wanted to take on this project because while I was writing my dissertation, I was thinking about kind of the bigger connections that my dissertation, which is on slavery specifically in Florence, was having, and I was looking at my next steps. And so after getting this project, it actually expanded my project into the Western Mediterranean, including Marseille and Valencia into my postdoctoral project. So this was something that I really integrated with my research very well. And so my volume, which covers the years from about 500 of the Common Era to 1450, is what is traditionally known as the Middle Ages in European historiography. And we really wanted to use pre-modern era rather than the Middle Ages to not impose this kind of Western idea of the middle to other human experiences, other cultural frameworks and societies. And it's also one that really emphasizes these human experiences rather than the quantitative data and the economic data. And that is kind of the approach I really thought was useful, and the approach that Benjamin came to me with, in that we wanted to kind of look at the people as people rather than as slaves. And through them, seeing them as people, the networks that they could create, the positions they had in society, it's not really sort of the idea of a social death, rather they had afterlives, they had networks, they were able to negotiate their positions in society. As well, this volume was a little bit more difficult in that we chose to integrate all the authors and regions into each thematic chapter. So this really decentralized Europe, and in a lot of the chapters will start with other places. And we thought that this was important in that, I mean, reading from 500 to 1450, it's really a Western idea of periodization. For example, in China, these years really don't mark the beginning or the end of anything. So by doing this, we really wanted not to have a chapter focus on Europe, for example, but rather to have a wider thematic approach to each chapter. Unfortunately, we weren't able to include the Americas, and that is one of my biggest regrets of the chapter. And we could talk about this a little bit later, into why this happened and how. But yeah, but this volume, sorry, really tries to challenge the idea that slavery ended after the fall of Rome in 500, and that it really persisted in different ways throughout the Eurasian and African continents, and that they really happened in very different ways with different legal systems, and really, but they were all so interconnected. So this is kind of sort of a network approach that I worked with through this volume.
Thank you so much, Angela. Ryan.
Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you, Ana Lucia, for hosting. I'm very happy to be here, and actually, in honor of my colleague Benjamin, I'm sitting in a law library behind me, our statutes from Arizona Revised Statutory Law. So I'm a social and cultural historian of Latin America. I came to this project a little late, in part because of lots of reasons, but really Benjamin's own force and willingness and interest in celebrating this project. I was at first skeptical. I was hesitant to jump into a project that sort of, at first glance, seemed to reiterate in some ways an old story about slavery. I worked on volume 3, the volume called in Age of Encounters, which roughly runs from 1450 to 1700. That was part of the appeal for me, because the periodization itself was a little bit subversive. I think Angela spoke to some of this as well about sort of changing sort of the paradigm around even the terminology. Benjamin and I went back and forth about the subheading in the Age of Encounters. And we workshopped lots of different ones, never really settling on many. And actually, we did settle on the Age of Encounters. And I will just say, subversively, the first subheading that I included is in the Age of Encounters, question mark, challenging the actual framework here. Um, in part, what attracted me to this project was that it was global. It was focused on cultural history. I was thrilled to engage with scholars and works that looked at slavery and slaveries, to echo what Grant noted, in a broader capacity. To think about the ways that enslaved peoples, in particular, were at the center of the stories of slavery, of an enslavement. Um, this is arguably an important volume in this sort of series because it takes up the transatlantic slave trade, which already we've hinted at in a couple of ways. But one of the things that we tried to do and really stress is that it was an important period, an important process was the expansion of the transatlantic slave trade, but it wasn't unique and it wasn't the only one. It was different by scale, but it figured into a series of other global networks, the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, other slave trade networks. One of the other issues that this volume does that I think is really important is that it serves to challenge the long-standing structuralist and constructivist approaches to understanding slavery that took slavery, and particularly this early time period, the early modern period, as really slavery was just one stage in capitalist development, and particularly the capitalist development of the European authority and power. And instead, what this volume attempts to do is actually focus on the enslaved and different forms of enslavement. Um, Unlike other periods, the early modern period is somewhat, when we talk about slavery, and the enslaved in particular, is really, we're overwhelmed at times by the quantitative data, the sheer numbers, which are important metrics and important markers of the institution. But actually, surprisingly, we lack a lot of qualified information about the actual people and the humans involved, and what enslavement meant in different parts around the world. So while volume 2, Angela, might have been a little bit underrepresented with the Americas, it's not in volume 3. Certainly the Americas are a part of the story, but the stories of the enslaved are not just about African people, they're about indigenous people. They're in the Americas. They're not actually even just about indigenous people. They're people of mixed ethnic descent. They're stories about enslaved peoples in the Ottoman world, in Asia, in the Pacific as well. So this volume really tries to tell the human stories of slavery. One thing I'll just say, as I don't want to go too long here, but I started this volume, in my introduction, I start this volume with an uprising in Mexico City in the early 17th century that involves free and enslaved people. It involves Africans, it involves native people, it involves so-called castas, people of mixed ethnicity. And the uprising itself is fascinating. There's a lot going on there. But really, for our purposes, what I was interested in and what I think this story helps open up is that the responses to this uprising were noteworthy. Following around 1600, the responses by colonial authorities were to double down and actually to start to codify racial categories. And in that regard, the ideas that some of we think about are so intertwined in slavery, African peoples being subjugated, became visible through the restrictions placed on a whole broad variety of subjugated peoples in the Americas, in Mexico first, but in broadly speaking in the Americas. So it's been a great pleasure to work on this volume, and I'm thrilled to be a part of this conversation here today.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Mariana.
Hello, everyone. I want to start by thanking Ana Lúcia Araújo for hosting us today, but also thanking Benjamin for the leadership in envisioning this project, but also having patience with us because there were difficult moments. You know, this project was in a way shaped by the global pandemic, and it affected all of the volumes and all of the authors and editors. So I appreciate the patience that Benjamin had when it was a difficult moment and people had to withdraw from the project. Several authors had to withdraw from the project. And thank you for inviting me to edit Volume 4. So I was in charge of Volume 4, which is Age of Empires, and I got very clear instructions that it was not to celebrate not only abolition, but not to celebrate European empires. And I think we did so. I think it's a volume that shows that the multiplicity of empires that existed in the 18th and in the 19th century, but also how the expansion of European empires completely transformed societies all over the world. I was lucky enough to work with 10 authors, and I had a commitment to include junior and senior scholars and scholars based in the Global South or scholars from the Global South. I also, I didn't want to make a volume that centered the experience of people writing in the, in Western academia. So besides decentering Europe, my goal was also to decenter the US experience when we talk about the 18th and in the 19th century. And my authors were quite good. The authors who joined me in Volume 4 were quite good in doing that. So there's lots of emphasis on Africa and African societies, but also on societies in Latin America and in Asia, more generally. What else can I say? One point that I want to emphasize that it came across already by the previous editors. I think all of us made a commitment in centering people. This was about a global, a cultural history of slaveries and human trafficking. So more than talking about numbers, although we do talk about numbers when they are available, we wanted to focus on how these global processes affect individuals. And I think they are very compelling and powerful stories in each one of the chapters that help us to see how people in different parts of the world have their lives transformed by the events in the 18th and in the 19th century. I was quite pleased with the final result and the fact that in all of the chapters, all of the contributors refused to celebrate the 19th century as a moment of abolition. There was a clear commitment in showing how the 19th century is a moment of profound violence that affect people all over the country, and the consequences of the expansion of internal violence in different of these now collapsing or struggling empires. I really appreciate the fact that there is a thematically consistency across the volumes. I haven't been able to read all of the volumes yet, but I think it is an interesting approach to see a particular theme such as enslavement of children, or looking at the case of labor and how it shapes a cultural history, how it changed in different contexts and in different historical moments. And I think that can be a very interesting reading rather than going reading an entire volume, going by theme, and it can be very, a different take in this entire process. Anyway, I think this is what I had centered. So I am in charge of Age of Empires, but I can tell you that there is much more than European empires in this volume. So I hope people will have a chance to read it and engage with the work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariana. Thank you. Enrique.
Right. So when Benjamin asked me if I wanted to become an editor, he probably assumed that I wanted to do the period that Mariana did, because I wrote a book about slave women and other pieces about slavery. But by the time he asked me, I had long moved away from slavery and I was working on the 20th century. And I'd just been teaching a module. I designed a module called Unfree Labor Across Time and Place. So in different sessions, we were looking at different types of unfree labor, but using different case studies. And from that module, I learned that that first half of the 20th century, the one that my volume covers, is actually one where you see an increase in slavery and human trafficking. And so I found that this was a great opportunity to actually learn more about that. I don't write myself about unfree labor in the first half of the 20th century, but I do work on the colonies at that period. So from that perspective, I saw it as a great opportunity to learn a lot more. So the people who contributed to my volume, we have a political scientist, we have a legal scholar, no, 2 legal scholars. The rest are historians. Some of them are area specialists. So we have a Russian historian who contributed, a historian who works largely on Mauritania, another one who works on Nigeria. But what they all did is really drew examples from across the globe. And they did bring in their own research, but they really, really made an effort in all of their chapters to really be as global as possible. Unlike, the other volumes, this volume covers only 45 years, essentially. So it's in terms of period, it's probably the smallest, I think. But a lot was happening in that period. And what the book really argues is that the increase in slavery and human trafficking in this very short period of time was the result of various factors. So largely colonialism maturing. So you see the peak of colonialism. The colonial empires need more labor. They resort often to unfree labor. Another factor was the fact that economies that were industrializing, for example, like Japan, were looking more afield for natural resources, but also for cheap labor. And then obviously, as well in this period, you've got the global wars that led to new demands for forced labor. And one of the things that what is striking, I think, although all the writers, all the contributors tried to be as global as possible, there are still gaps in work on unfree labor in that period, global gaps, let's say. So there is a clear gap, for example, Latin America. There is some about indenture in the Caribbean, but there isn't much yet written, unless maybe Ryan can correct me as a Latin Americanist, on unfree labor forms in that first half of the 20th century in Latin America. So there's still work that scholars can do. One thing that really came out as well in all of the chapters is that in that particular period, the Atlantic slavery that Mariana's volume covers became a model, a benchmark against which people judged whether something was slavery or not. Because also in this period, it's the first time that you see international regulations around slavery. There's the 1926 League of Nations Slavery Convention, and then the 1931 ILO Forced Labor Convention. And for example, in the colonies, when colonial officials had to implement those regulations, because they had that notion of what constitutes slavery was the one called Atlantic slavery, a lot of forms of unfree labor simply did not register for them as slavery. So abolitionists at the time, abolitionist groups, they were still working. They didn't just disband after, Atlantic slavery ended. They continued, but they struggled really often to end these systems because the officials, the people who had to implement these regulations, did not register certain things as slavery or human trafficking. So it's been for me an incredible journey on many years in the making, this volume, but I have learned a lot. And Benjamin was saying earlier on about using the volumes for teaching. I was really glad that what I was teaching brought me to this volume, but my next step may be to actually use the volumes in my teaching as well.
Thank you so much. I would like to express my appreciation to the editors who were able to join. And as I mentioned, several were not. The sixth volume is edited by Matilda Ventrella. Matilda is an Italian scholar who works at in the University in Liverpool, and she's a legal scholar, a lawyer by training, and an expert on human trafficking. And the final volume in the series covers the period from the end of World War II, so 1946, to the present day. And the important part of that periodization there, well, there are several. The first is, of course, the international recognition in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and subsequently the 1956 Slavery Convention, and then later on human trafficking protocols of the global abolition of all forms of slavery and human trafficking, and in tension with that, the persistence and the continued growth of slavery and human trafficking into the present day, to the point where today scholars and activists are in agreement that there are more people in enslavement and slave-like conditions than ever before in human history. How did we get there? How can it be the case? So although Dr. Ventrella isn't here to speak a little bit today, I wanted to make sure that you understood that as the participants that the sixth volume covers that particular period to the present day. And it is also composed of fewer, the contributors are fewer in number in terms of historians. As you can imagine, there are sociologists, political scientists, and legal scholars who are part of that. And as some of you probably have picked up, I became a lawyer during this process. I took my JD and I represent asylum seekers and human trafficking victims in court. And it's been very much informative in terms of my own intellectual development over the years. So I'd like to thank all the editors, but also acknowledge that there are several author contributors who are in the audience today as well, and that we very much appreciate their contributions. So I think, Ana Lucia, I'm going to pass it back to you, and we're very happy to field questions.
Yes, then thank you so much, Benjamin, and to all the editors who were able to make it. Then now we have this space for questions. Then we have about 20 minutes. And if you have questions to the editors, if we have authors, that I see some of them here, those of you who will be watching this on YouTube after, you will not be able to see the names, but we have several of them who are around. And if you have any questions or you want to talk about your experience contributing to the different volumes, please go ahead and you can raise your hand or put your questions in the chat, or just go ahead and speak. Thank you. I don't see any volunteers. So perhaps you could start with one question from me. I contributed to this volume, and I am familiar with the project since its inception. Then, of course, that this is a difficult project as to create and to develop, and also to accomplish at the end. Of course, we have here 6 volumes. We could have more volumes. Then this is a limitation that the collection itself imposes. And of course, depending on the editor, as Benjamin said in the beginning, this could be a very different kind of collection, even if we have the framework of cultural history. So I would like, if some of you can talk about a little bit about what were the main difficulties of putting together this kind of project in terms of the things that are not here that you would like them to be here? And I think that some of you mentioned that. But also the fact that, of course, that there is all this centrality of Atlantic slavery, and the book club itself that we created back in the time during the pandemic, the Slavery Archive Book Club, it was much centered on Atlantic slavery. That is what I do. But then there are challenges to talk about slavery in other parts of the world that were not in the Americas, and especially then in periods that that are not part of the Atlantic framework. So if you would like to discuss a little bit on that, I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Anusia. I'll say a couple of words and then other people feel free to jump in. I would say there's a couple of sort of conceptual and intellectual challenges that were preponderant throughout the entire process. And then there are just a couple of sort of structural, logistical issues. So intellectually and conceptually, it's a big, I mean, I admit to a certain hubris on my part in imagining that we could create different periodizations of slavery. But I was convinced that I didn't want to recreate another version of something that looks like, for example, the Cambridge history of slavery, right? Which is very Eurocentric and American-centric in its narrative. And I don't mean to criticize it, but I didn't want to recreate something that existed. And yet, as many of us are historians, and periodization is one of the central crafts of a historian, working with primary sources, explaining change over time, understanding what a period is, giving and challenging periods. Some are recognizable. The Cold War, that's something that we know what it means. But the Renaissance doesn't mean much to China in the same period, and it doesn't mean much to the Oceanic region or other parts of the world. So you can begin with the intellectual statement that we need to provide and provoke challenges to periodization, but it's quite another thing, and maybe a little bit too ambitious, to try to recreate. So one way to accomplish that was just to sort of change the time periods, not, for example, to fixate on 1492, right? So 1450 allows the authors and the editors of both volumes on either side to address what the world looked like prior to the, if you like, the Columbian collapse of world geography, right? That post-Columbian moment where all the world is brought together in a way that it had never been for 40,000, 20,000 years. So those are some of the intellectual challenges. And then logistically, just convincing people to write synthetically and globally when most historians are regionalists or nation-focused, or very few historians today, perhaps even less so than before, are thematic historians, right? Economic history as a subfield is rapidly declining there are fewer and fewer there used to be departments of economic history. People wrote about economics, but so even thematic approaches to the essays and convincing people that they could write about what they know, but also to ask them to go beyond and try to pull on primary sources and scholarly work from periods that they are not familiar with, that they are maybe uncomfortable with. That was difficult, and people have done it in different ways, and each volume looks different. And I would say they've all done it in very effective ways, but there's no one solution to this. So I think, it's a challenge to future writers of slaveries. I sometimes wish that's what we'd call the volume. That would have been a hard sell for Bloomsbury, but it's definitely an indication, right? Just during the period that this was conceived, I'll give you one final example, then maybe some other people want to speak. But just during the period that this was conceived, there was a discursive shift away from talking about slave to enslaved persons, right? And we all know it, those of us who study and write about slavery, to write that someone is a slave as opposed to an enslaved person in the minds and in the writing of a lot of people is a very different thing. Now, I have different mixed feelings about this, but it's a very big change that has taken place in scholarship. And it is very important that that change is taking place. But that is not something that you can very easily navigate when you're dealing with 6 volumes and each composed of 9 chapters. So who are writing in different ways. So there's lots of logistical issues, but also intellectual issues. Perhaps some of my peers would like to share their thoughts.
If I could come in, what I really liked is that, and Mariana, I think, mentioned it as well, that each volume has the same chapters. So chapter on gender, chapter on abolition. That was very helpful. And there was a good outline of what each of those chapters should be. And as Benjamin says, all the authors interpreted the brief slightly differently, but they made a real effort. But one thing that there is no chapter of is cultural representations, memories of slavery, enslavement. I tried to sneak some of that in the introduction to my volume. But obviously, especially, let's say for the Atlantic slavery, there is a lot now on commemoration, reparation, those issues. So, there's only as much as one can do, but also, as Benjamin was also saying, the field is still evolving, it's still changing. So if we were to do this volume in a couple of years' time, there may well be another chapter or 2 chapters that we wanted to add to the one, maybe.
Thank you. Anybody else would like to chime in?
So I would have another question. Okay, I see that someone perhaps is trying to. No, I don't see anyone. My other question, because I think that this would be very useful in terms of those who are attending this session even afterwards, is the issue of teaching. Then, because one of the first element was the difficulties in terms of the editorial project, but in terms of teaching and thinking about this series as then a teaching tool that can be used in the classroom. What do you think that would be the ways that these volumes would contribute to teach slavery comparatively across various periods of time? Because, of course, depending on the course and depending on the curriculum, you have slavery being taught perhaps in programs that teach classics or human trafficking. Then in history, I ask myself, and perhaps if you have ideas in how the volumes can be useful for teaching.
So I think Dr. Kashanipour had to leave because he is. Oh, no, he's back again. Ryan, would you like to address the matter, or?
Yeah, the teaching question. I'm gonna arc back to this conversation about periodization that I think you started with, Benjamin. And there's something important there. Periodization is often a tool, right? It's a tool, it's something that we as historians often spend a lot of time with, but it can become sort of teleological, where we just over rely on it, where we use it as a well, I understand that in this category. In terms of teaching, one of the things that I appreciate about these volumes is that the periodization isn't just the standard. It actually is, there's an attempt to, through the lens of slavery and enslavement, ask questions about it. And I haven't taught with volume of any of the volumes, but I do look forward to I teach on, and I'm looking forward to it in the context. Try to make sense of our own period being, off.
I think we might have lost Ryan, but
Yes.
I understood. Let me just pick up one word, and then I see a question from Esteban has been asked. So the issue of how the books can be taught is also, it's important to think of also primary sources. So each of these volumes is rich with primary sources. So I'm actually teaching a new course this semester that uses entirely the 6 volumes, and it's structured thematically. And I reorganized the entire syllabus of global slavery around themes. And they are reading all 6 chapters on economics in a module on economics. They're reading all 6 chapters on a module on politics. And the way that I thought about this initially was that this would just work and it would make sense, but I didn't really thought through it. But now that I'm actually teaching it, like to really think about the ideologies and the definitions of slavery across time and space, it's quite transformative from even my own sort of thinking about slavery. Because of course I've read every chapter in these 6 volumes multiple times, but to suddenly start reading all 6 on ideologies and definitions again, together, apart from the rest of it's changing my understanding of. So I want to draw people's attention to that the volumes are replete with primary sources, which is very important for undergraduate instruction. But it is also structured thematically, which is a very seductive and useful way of teaching, I think, something like global slavery. And then I see that Esteban has a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Esteban. I don't know. Okay, I want you to here at the spotlight.
Yes, so I'm wondering, in such a massive project with so long time periods, how do you negotiate definitions of slavery? I'm more curious here because I'm pretty sure each of the volumes discusses it thoroughly, but more curious here how you negotiated with each other, right? If you had to like come to agreements, are we going to take like a legal status perspective, or is more about the source need to express the person pronouncing themselves as enslaved, or right? And I'm curious if there were points in which there were contradictory definitions, right, between, for example, time periods or places within the same time period, right? How did you solve those problems?
Thank you for that question. Would any of the editors like to address it?
I can talk a little bit about this. Thank you for the question, Esteban. First of all, the first chapter of each volume is on definitions and ideology of slavery. So in every volume, will have a chapter that deals with definitions. And I cannot, I'm not speaking on behalf of all editors, but in the case of the chapter that in the volume that I added, it's a co-author piece, which was very good. Scholars specialize in different parts of the world. So there is already a debate inside of that chapter. So readers can get a glance that depending where you work, but the authors were quite successfully in showing the different definitions and how they change over time, which I think is also something important. But I will stop here. This is what happens in chapter 1, or in chapter 1 of each volume.
Thank you, Mariana. I can just say that I wrote the definitions chapter for volume 1. And this was a fun experience for me because my very first article my very first articles published were on 2 forms of enslavement in ancient Rome. And for those who don't know, my first 2 degrees are in Greek and Roman history. And my first theses were about Roman re-enslavement policy, which I was fascinated by, slaves of the punishment. The idea that you could be punished with enslavement, which has happened in time and space in different parts of the world, as it turns out. So what it forced me to do was to dive deep to dive widely and to dive thinly to look at all the different terms that exist that I could find documentation from, as Grant said, both textually but also visually, right? So when we were able to look at Semitic texts that have been transcribed from cuneiform tablets that provided one set of terminologies, whether it was, but when we looked at monuments from Mesoamerica, we were able to see different ideologies and different definitions of what it means to be enslaved, to be dominated. For example, the volumes are all lavishly illustrated. Each chapter has several beautiful photographs, color photographs, and in the definitions chapter that I wrote for volume 1, we have a very famous image from Mayan America of a enslaver or a chief or a king sitting atop the bodies of enslaved people as if it's a human stool or a human seat. And so the ideas of, and that's in fact the unit that I've just finished teaching in my class, right, is to look at all these different existing definitions at moments in time and to really bring to the fore the idea that there is no fixity of definition. We don't have to agree on a particular set of terminologies. But as a cultural history, right, with human stories at the center, we have to attend to the complexity and the multivalence and the multiplicity of definitions and terminologies. Thank you for that question, Esteban.
Thank you, Benjamin. And Esteban, do we have more questions or comments? Then I leave with you, Benjamin, if you want to conclude, to say any additional comments, and then I will just call the meeting and then invite everyone to join next week because we have another discussion. But Benjamin, let us know if you have any final thoughts.
Well, thank you again, Ana Lucia, for this great opportunity to talk about this project. It was as I said, a long time in the making, but I'm very keen to see it taught. I'm very keen to see people using this both as a intellectual resource, but as a pedagogical resource. And so we're very fortunate that Bloomsbury has provided all the participants today with complimentary digital access to the series. And I encourage you to use that if your university library, if you already have it through your university library, then that's wonderful. But if you don't, that is available to you. And I would like to hear from you. I would like to hear from you if you're using it, because one of the other amazing developments in the last several years in terms of digital publication is that things that once were fixed in time and space and never revisited can be revisited. And so we can, to draw on my colleagues' observation, we may need to add chapters in the future, and that's a possibility. That's the sort of thing that can take place, and things can be added as we consider either omissions or additions. So I'd like to hear from people who are considering teaching it or who are using it if they are studying, right? If they're using it as a tool in the classroom, if one of their professors is offering it, I'd like to hear from them too. So again, thank you very much, Ana Lucia. Thank you to all my colleagues and peers who have made this possible. I'm very appreciative. And Ana Lucia, some final words about next week?
Yes, thank you so much, Benjamin, and all the editors. And just to invite you then to join us next week, we have the section with Julia Garfield and her, sorry that I'm trying to do this, this book published with Yale University Press in 2025. Then last June, I have Avenged America. Then this is going to be on Saturday, September 20th at 2 p.m. Then Eastern time. And also we have in the chat the sessions, then the full calendar for October and November. And so you can register and join us in the next Saturdays. So thank you so much, everyone who joined. And this is going to be on YouTube soon, as soon as I am able to fix the video and upload there, and I will let you know. Thank you so much. I will now stop the recording somewhere, which is